Okay, welcome back. We're moving on to chapter 10, getting towards the end of the book. Let's see what happened. There was an accident and a fire and smoke and the sound of explosions. And Flapjack, Marjorie, and Winnie are watching it from afar by the lake, and they're going to go into town and see what happened. I bet they're pretty worried, and hopefully their father is not involved. I don't know. Let's see. It's been a really long time since I've read this. 10. The first thing they saw was the collapsed tunnel entrance, where a large hole had stood 10 minutes before. There was now only a jumble of rocks and dirt. The air hung heavily with dust. Most of the shouting had stopped, but the foremen were still trying to organize the crews into long lines. One foreman saw the truckers pull up in the buggy. He rushed over to him. "Mrs. Tucker?" "Yes." "How'd you get here so soon?" She looked confused. "I don't understand. I mean, it's only been minutes." "How did you know that Eli—" He stopped abruptly, seeing the change in her expression. "I didn't know," she said slowly. She pointed to the tunnel. "Eli. Eli's trapped in there. He came over this afternoon," said the foreman. "We needed his help." "What happened?" asked Flapjack. "Someone set a charge too close to the support beams. The explosion knocked several of them out. Some men are trapped inside. About 8, I think." He gulped. "But don't you worry, we'll get Eli out. We'll get them all out." Marjorie nodded dully. Winnie looked at the huge pile of rubble. The crews were digging frantically at it, but they didn't seem to be making much of a dent. Winnie felt dizzy. Her father was trapped behind the small mountain. She wanted to be brave, but she only felt frozen. It was easy to read about courage in a book. It was different when it was really happening. "Step aside, make room." It was Mr. Strobridge. His beard looked even darker in the lengthening shadows. Winnie was glad to see him. He was in charge, wasn't he? He would sure do something. He started by shouting orders. Some men brought up more pickaxes and shovels. Others tied ropes around some of the fallen timbers. "Come on, Winnie! Faster, faster!" Winnie thought. "What's going on?" her mother asked. "It looks as if some things are being done twice. Why isn't everyone working together?" "White crews won't work with the Celestials," Flapjack explained. "Why not?" asked Winnie. The old miner sighed. "Because they're Chinese. That's all the reason they need. White workers are willing to boss the Celestials, but they won't work as a team." "But this is an emergency," thought Winnie. Winnie looked around anxiously. It was then she saw Lee standing quietly beside her. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Winnie Tucker. I did not mean to frighten you." "You look pretty frightened yourself," thought Winnie. Then she remembered what the foreman had said. 8 or 9 men were trapped in the tunnel. Was one of them Lee's brother? "My father is in there," she said quietly. "And Tom," said Lee. "What if they never get out?" thought Winnie. "What if they're already—" "Listen up, men," Mr. Strobridge called out. "Digging will take hours or even days. We have neither. We may not even have minutes. Who knows how much air they have?" He sighed. "We'll have to risk blasting." "That might just seal them in," said the foreman. Mr. Strobridge tugged on his beard. "It might, or it might blow them to kingdom come. But what other choice is there?" No one answered. "Bring on the nitroglycerin," he ordered. Workers carefully carried the explosive from the back of the nearby wagon. Flapjack whistled softly. "That's tricky stuff," he whispered. "A lot more powerful than gunpowder." The miners carefully put down the explosive. Winnie watched them closely. They seemed very calm as they dug holes for their charges. The nitroglycerin itself was an oily yellow liquid. It did not look like much. "Hold on, Papa," she whispered. "Hold on." When the miners finished, they lit the fuses. Everyone ducked for cover. The explosion rocked the canyon. Winnie had covered her ears, but they still ached from the sound. Marjorie Tucker peered through the dust. "How long?" she whispered. A picture for you. The crews were scrambling up the rubble. They cleared away a good bit with that first blast, Flapjack said. Now they'll... Suddenly another explosion rocked the landscape. 3 men were tossed into the air. They landed hard and didn't move. "Confound it!" Mr. Strobridge shouted. "I'll have Howden's hide." "Who's Howden?" Winnie asked. Flapjack brushed the dust from his coat. "He makes the nitroglycerin for the railroad. But blaming him for the explosion is like blaming the candy maker for giving you a toothache." "What went wrong?" asked Marjorie. "One charge did not explode on time," said Lee. "We use nitroglycerin to bite the mountain, but sometimes it bites us back." "The fuse may have been set wrong," said Flapjack, "until somebody jarred it." Other workers stepped forward cautiously with stretchers for the injured men. "I don't see anything," said Marjorie. Flapjack squinted through the dust. "That first blast just got things started," he said. "Now they'll dig for a while before blasting again." Lee was wringing his hands. He wanted to help, but the foreman had already shooed him away twice. Winnie looked down. Her own hands were shaking. "I hate all this waiting," she said. "Waiting is hard," said Lee. "It is a thing my father talked about much. The worst waiting for him came from his trip to America. The ship was so full the men could barely lie down. There was fighting over food and space. There was much sickness everywhere. But worst of all, he said, was the waiting. Days and days and more days to come. Men died all around him. The smell was terrible. The food was so bad. He closed his eyes while he ate. Still, there was more waiting. He wondered if he had made a good choice. He had been poor in China, but China was home. Leaving had been hard. The voyage was harder. Finally, he reached San Francisco. So much remained unknown, but at least the waiting was over. He would never forget it, he said. It took an hour of digging before they were ready to blast again. "It's an upside-down day for sure, Papa," thought Winnie. "But it's not over yet." As the fuses were lit again, Winnie squeezed her eyes shut and looked away. The next explosion peppered everyone with pebbles and dirt. When the dust cleared, there was a small opening in the tunnel. 2 crews rushed forward and enlarged the hole. "We found them!" they called out. Everyone hushed, waiting for news from inside the tunnel. "And they're all alive! Hooray!" shouted Winnie. She felt happy and excited and relieved all at once. She gave her mother a big hug. He then hugged Flapjack, and then she hugged Lee. He even hugged her back. Then they realized they were hugging and quickly jumped apart. The crews stepped aside and the miners emerged from the tunnel hole. One was limping. Another was favoring an arm. Several were carried out on stretchers. "Tom! Tom!" Lee rushed to the side of a man on a stretcher. He was so covered in dirt that Winnie couldn't get a good glimpse at him. "Eli! Papa!" Her father was being helped out of the tunnel. "Careful there," he said, as they rushed forward. "I think I busted something." The next few minutes were filled with hugs and kisses. Before they were done, it was hard to tell who was wearing the most dirt. Winnie had tried to say something, but the words kept getting stuck in her throat. But now she looked at her father, covered in smudges and grit, and laughed. "I think you're going to need a bath," she said. Eli Tucker smiled, and then clutched his side. "I think we all will," he said, wincing. For once, Winnie didn't mind the idea of a bath at all.